What I want to talk to you about today is how to get rid of intrusive thoughts and focus your mind on positive outcomes without resorting to things like antidepressant drugs, which have terrible side effects, costly stays in psychiatric care, which can easily run into the tens of thousands, or sobbing on a therapist's couch every week for the rest of your life. And to do that, I think the first question that I want you to consider is, well, where do thoughts actually come from? In particular, where do intrusive thoughts actually come from? Now, I think most people have the experience that as we go through life, in our internal dialogue, that's the voice that we use to think for ourselves and about ourselves. What we're trying to do is essentially write our own autobiography. But from time to time, we seem to get distracted or interrupted or disturbed by these thoughts that just spring out seemingly from nowhere and say things like, you're an idiot, or nobody likes you, or remember when this rubbish thing happened to you, or you did this silly thing. And it's really distracting. It really prevents you from focusing. It prevents you from achieving the things that you want to in life. And we have a tendency to think, well, these thoughts, we just want to get rid of them. Well, the first thing that we need to do to understand what these thoughts are is to think about where they come from. And the first possibility is that intrusive thoughts would come from something like a machine on the inside of your mind. And the kind of machine that I'm thinking about here is one of these Alexa machines that Amazon sells, or Google have one as well. And you say things like, hey, Alexa, play classical music. And Alexa says, now playing classic FM, which is quite helpful. Now, if we look at what we've got going on in our own mind, we've got all of these things that we hear, like you're an idiot, or a part that criticizes us, or whatever it is. And if we think of that as being rather like an Alexa machine, well, how do Alexa machines actually respond to us? Well, the kind of things we might say to Alexa is, Alexa, what's the time? And she'd say, well, it's 8:15. Or we might say, what's the weather like in London? And Alexa might say, oh, it's sunny in London. It seems unlikely, but she might. We might say, Alexa, play Hotel California by the Beatles, by the Eagles even. And she might say, I don't know that one, which is disappointing. But it's still the kind of thing that you might expect from an Alexa machine. But with our own thoughts, and particularly the intrusive or disturbing thoughts, they just don't seem quite as helpful as what we get from these Alexa machines. So maybe we should think of the thoughts and the origin of the thoughts in our minds as coming from a slightly different place, from something that's not quite so machine-like. And the other possibility, because a thought is a piece of language and there's only a couple of places it could really come from, it could come from an Alexa machine, or the other possibility is that an intrusive thought could come from something like a person, because that's where language comes from. It comes from computers, or it comes from people. Now, you might be wondering, why does it matter where they come from? I just want to get rid of them. Why should I care where the thoughts actually come from? Well, for a couple of reasons. Firstly, you've probably tried answering these thoughts. Maybe you've been reasonable and logical. Maybe you've even argued with them. Maybe you've become frustrated and angry and shouted at them, or you've simply tried to ignore them. But nothing seems to work. Everything that you've tried so far makes no difference whatsoever to the intensity of the thoughts, or the frequency, or the content of the thoughts. They just keep coming back over and over again. To transform these thoughts into a positive internal dialogue, you actually need to think differently about them. So for a start, don't think that you can say whatever you want to yourself and it will make no difference. You know that in a relationship you can't say whatever you want and think that it's going to make no difference. You have to be very careful what you say to your partner in a relationship. You have to be very careful what you say to your friends if you want them to continue being your friends. You have to be very careful what you say to your boss as well if you want to carry on working and if you want to get promoted. You are not an unfeeling machine like an Alexa. So you can't just tell yourself to shut up. But you can tell an Alexa machine to shut up, and she'll be okay with that. You can't just ignore yourself and ignore the thoughts in your own mind, but you can just ignore Alexa and go to another room, and that's no problem. And you mustn't shout at yourself and think that that's not going to have an impact. But all that will happen if you shout at Alexa is that she'll stop talking to you, which might be what you wanted anyway. Now, in order to beat anxiety and achieve peace of mind, you should imagine that the thoughts in your head come from a person. We've talked about this. But what kind of person should you imagine? Well, you can kind of think of your body as being rather like a ship. And you can think of you, your conscious mind, the part of you that is responsible for your internal dialogue, the part of you or the part of your thinking that you use for solving crossword puzzles and things, to be rather like the captain of that ship that sets the direction and decides where the ship should go. And then the origin of the thoughts that you've been labeling as intrusive or disturbing thoughts, well, they're rather like the crew on that ship. And they have something to say. And what it tends to be, the content of their message tends to be warning, or you're moving too fast, or you can't be sure. Now, these crew members, I think that it's quite nice to think of them as always looking out for you, always doing what they think is right for you, but always doing what they think is right for themselves as well. And as a good captain, what you should probably be doing is you should be interacting with the members of the crew, therefore interacting with the thoughts that come through your mind, and you should be limiting the amount of time that you spend writing your autobiography or writing in the captain's log, if you like. You should spend more time having a conversation on the inside than you spend just trying to present yourself in your imagination in a way that makes you look good. I'm hoping this is making sense to you, because I want to add another level to it now. And this next level that I'm going to add to it is going to make it a little bit easier for you to understand. Because whilst some of this might seem very new, I think there's a way in which you can think about it that makes it seem very familiar. So let's call the crew members, let's say that they're parts of your unconscious mind. And I really like the term parts, because I think we all instinctively know what a part is. For example, maybe there's a part of you that wants a new relationship, but there's a part of you that's afraid of getting hurt again. And that part is telling you that you're moving too fast. But that part may also be responsible for doing whatever it can to prevent you from moving too fast, even if that looks rather like sabotaging every relationship you try to get into. Maybe there's a part of you that wants to start a business, but there's a part that just can't let go of the security of a 9-to-5. That part's saying, well, you can't be sure of what's going to happen. You don't know if you start this business whether or not you're going to be able to pay the mortgage or buy school uniforms for the kids or put food on the table, so you shouldn't do it. And every time you start thinking about starting a new business, you feel bad or you end up procrastinating or being distracted by this part in an attempt to make sure that you don't go ahead and jeopardize the security that you've built up in your life. Now at this point, maybe you're wondering, well, if that's what they've got to say, why don't they just say that? Why don't the parts simply have an honest and frank conversation so that, we can sort all of this nonsense out and get on with life? Well, let me ask you, what kind of captain have you actually been? Have you been the kind of captain that listens to the crew and takes their advice? And as a result, have the parts of your unconscious mind come to trust you? Or have you been trying to ignore them your whole life? Perhaps because you didn't realize they were there. Or perhaps just because you didn't like what they were saying and you didn't think that you had to pay any attention to it. You thought that the best thing for you was to ignore it. You see, the reality is that you consciously may be looking out into the future, and maybe this is what you see for yourself. If only you could get rid of this part of you that's holding you back or sabotaging you or criticizing you, judging you, calling you not good enough, whatever it is. You think if you could get rid of that part of your life, then you would be able to create something that looks like this. Maybe this is an exciting relationship, but maybe it's a business, maybe it's a change to your living situation. Who knows? It could be anything. This is what you see and you think it would be great. However, it's not what your unconscious sees. Your unconscious mind sees an iceberg. It doesn't think that you're going to get to the beach. It looks rather like this. You think that you're on a direct course, just heading for the beach, and all you need to do is get rid of the part of you that's holding you back. But there's an iceberg in the way, and the part of you that's holding you back is trying to prevent you from crashing into that iceberg. So to achieve happiness, fulfillment, and peace of mind, here's what you have to do. So the first thing that you have to do is you need to acknowledge the parts of your unconscious mind. You need to recognize that they're there. Now, most people will never do that. Most people will never even think about it. Most people will always label these parts that are criticizing them or holding them back or sabotaging their relationships or judging them or whatever it is. They will just label them a bad part and try to get rid of it. But that's not the way to think about it. If you, for example, were to go skiing and you fall over and you break your arm and you look down and you see your arm's all mangled, your first reaction wouldn't be, oh, well, we might as well cut that off then. Your first reaction would be to think, oh, goodness, what can we do? And let's get to the doctor and do anything we can to try and heal this arm up so that I can get back to using it and it can work correctly and properly for me again. You should take the same approach with the parts of your unconscious mind. If there's a part that is holding you back because it doesn't like the direction that you're going in, you need to acknowledge that the part exists and recognize that the parts do want what's best for you because they are you in a very real sense. You're more than just your conscious mind. You're more than just this very small part of experience that you're aware of any moment. There's way more going on under the surface, and that includes all of the parts of your unconscious mind. So number 2, the next thing, you need to be a good captain. And what does that mean? It means don't be a tyrant. It means be patient. You've ignored these parts for a long time, and now you're going to start listening as a result of learning what you're learning today. But you need to understand that these parts have been trying to communicate with you for a long, long time, and suddenly you've decided to start listening, and suddenly you've decided to start respecting them and taking them seriously. But they need to learn how to communicate with you, and you need to learn how to communicate with them. So it does involve being a little bit patient whilst you figure that relationship out, just like any other relationship might require a little bit of patience. It means listen as well. And listen without judgment, and listen without assuming that you already know what the communication means. You need to dig a little bit deeper. In the example of the part that's sabotaging relationships, for example, where you need to listen to what's going on and try to understand what the real meaning of that communication is, or what the real meaning of the action is. Let's say you have a tendency to get frustrated and angry after a certain amount of time in a relationship, and you have a voice that says, well, you shouldn't be with him or her because ... Well, listen to what that voice is saying and then ask it some questions. Don't ignore the parts and spend all your time doing your autobiography either, because that's what most people do most of the time, and it's particularly something that people do when they're suffering with anxiety, is they try and distract themselves with Sudoku puzzles or YouTube videos or whatever it is, which means that you never figure out what's causing the anxiety and you can never do anything to fix it. And the way to figure out what's causing the anxiety is to ask some intelligent questions. So maybe if you've got a part that's telling you, no, you really shouldn't go to that party, you could say, well, what would happen if we did go to that party? And maybe the part would open up a little bit more and say, well, you'll just be standing in the corner feeling stupid. And then you could ask questions like, well, what would be so bad about that? And you can start to dig into it a little bit more and understand more in terms of exactly what your limitation is. Because anxiety is just where you've come up against one of the limitations in your mind, and going beyond it is painful. So you need to understand what the limitation really is, and asking those questions gives you the limitation. You might also ask, well, what do we need to make sure, or what do we need to do to make sure that it doesn't happen? What do we need to do to make sure that when we go to parties in the future, we don't end up just standing in the corner on our own and feeling lonely? What is it that we need to do in a relationship, perhaps, to make sure that we can be a little bit more open with people without getting hurt? And you might get some interesting answers to these questions. It's important that you don't go into detective mode here. So what you're doing is having a conversation. You're not trying to figure things out based on what's happened to you in the past. You are trying to listen to the communications that originate in your unconscious mind and make sense of them, and then give feedback in the way that you would any other conversation. You might also ask, for what reason are you saying this to me now? sometimes that can give you really interesting answers as well. Sometimes you'll get answers that are quite cryptic, or sometimes you'll get answers that don't make a great deal of sense. But with all of this, it's about learning to speak to your unconscious, it's about learning to have the patience, and most importantly, it's about not assuming that you know best. Just because you're the conscious mind and just because you're the captain in this analogy here doesn't mean to say that you actually know best. The parts have a very important and very valid opinion, and also they have a great deal of control over your life. You may think that just because you have some executive control, for example, if you want to lift up your arm, you can probably lift up your arm and it will always do it. That doesn't mean to say that you're in control of every area of your life. It doesn't mean to say that you're the only person that gets to vote about the direction in which you go. The parts of your unconscious mind have a role to play there as well. And the reason why that's so important is because consciousness is a very limited phenomenon. You can only pay attention to a very small number of things at any point in time. I mean, it's probably about 4 or 5 things that you could pay attention to before you start getting confused. And you have a conscious perspective, but the parts of your unconscious mind have a different perspective. And one part will have a different perspective from another part. Now, you can think of perspective as being rather like this. Let's say that there's a window, an actual physical window that exists, and that you are looking out the window from one side of the room and your friend is looking out of the window from the other side of the room. And you're looking out and you see this. You say, "Oh, look at that cool cat out there. Isn't that cute?" And your friend looks out the window and sees this and says, "That's not a cat, that's a dog." Now, you're both correct, but the only way to resolve this is that one of you has to get up and walk to the other side of the room to be able to look out and see that there's both a cat and a dog there. Now, let's say that the window could be looking into the future. If we were to think about this in terms of what's happening with your unconscious mind and with the parts of your unconscious mind. And you have your perspective as you look out into the future. And what you see in the future for yourself, if you could just get rid of all of these intrusive thoughts that are holding you back, is life would be a beach. You'd be able to have a relationship. You'd be able to transform your body. You'd be able to start a business. Whatever it is that you want to do, you'd be able to achieve it. But your unconscious also has a perspective. And your unconscious looks out into the future and sees an iceberg. Now, the thing is, you're both right. You need to walk to the other position and look out into the future from that perspective, and you'd be able to see them both. The iceberg, for example, might be if the beach is being more open with people and having a larger social circle so that you can have more friends to rely on. The iceberg might be that you're a poor judge of character and you're going to bring lots of people into your life who could be quite damaging to you. And of course, you do want to know about the iceberg. You want to know that it's there. But the reason why you want to know that it's there is so that you can plot a course that doesn't go directly through the iceberg, because that's going to sink the ship and you and all of the parts of your unconscious mind are going to go down with it. So you need some help from one of the parts of your unconscious mind that's telling you don't go directly into the iceberg. You need to navigate around the iceberg, and then you can end up at the place where you can be, for example, more open with people and having a larger circle of friends. You need to learn how to be a better judge of character. That's the course correction that your unconscious mind is trying to make you take. So in summary, be a good captain. That means don't be a tyrant. Be patient. Listen to the parts of your unconscious mind because they do have some really useful advice for you. They see things that you don't see. Don't ignore them and spend all your time doing your autobiography, which is probably most of what you do at the moment. And instead, ask these intelligent questions. So ask, what would happen if we did do this thing that you're telling me not to do? Or what do we need to do to make sure that this iceberg that you see in the future doesn't sink us? How do we get around it? Or even, why are you saying this to me now? What's the purpose of you communicating this to me now? And remembering all the time to be patient and listen as you're asking these questions. And don't assume that you know best because, you didn't see the iceberg perhaps. And now your attention has been drawn to the iceberg, which means that you won't crash into it. And then make suggestions and listen to the feedback. That's really the key. That's the whole strategy for being able to deal with these intrusive thoughts. Now, I said that this was a way of getting rid of intrusive thoughts so that you could focus your mind on positive outcomes. And the way that it gets rid of intrusive thoughts is by changing your interpretation of the thoughts. So you don't see them as being intrusive, so that you see them as being really important communications, really important information that's coming from your unconscious mind that tells you that you need to make a change in your life. So if you've got anxiety, that's kind of like the smoke alarm is going off. And if that's happening in your house, well, probably someone's burning the toast, but not always. So you don't take the battery out of the smoke alarm, you leave it in there, and you respect the alarm when it comes on and you investigate to make sure that everything's okay. You should take exactly the same approach with the thoughts that you have been labeling as intrusive thoughts, and think of them not as intrusive thoughts, but really just as a way for you to understand what's out there in the future and what's existing in your unconscious mind right now.